The Lives of Man, A Guide to the Human States, Before Life, in the World, and After Death. Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad. Muslims today may differ over many things, but most share a general consciousness that an end is near. There is something in the air, a tense feeling of imminence, of history gathering pace for some remarkable event. This conviction is confirmed by the general unawareness of the non-Muslim collectivities, distracted by the myth of progress to what is taking place. Only the Muslims, it seems, have remembered that acceleration is more usually a sign of downward than of upward motion, and that if anything is certain about it, it is that it cannot be perpetually maintained. Hence we see that the community of Muhammad, may blessings and peace be upon him, stands almost alone in retaining an interest in traditional, God-given data about the end of time. The Quran, as the final message given to man before the judgment, contains very specific directions on how the last believers are to acquit themselves and what they must expect. It is true that whole sections of the Muslim nation, engrossed by the playthings and false gods of the age, think rarely of their future existence. But most Muslims still respond vividly to Friday's sermons, which speak of the last trumpet, of the judgment, to the delights of the garden and the torments of the fire. In every bookshop in the Islamic world, tracts on the subject continue to outsell almost any other kind of literature, serving the Muslim desire to know the road which leads to that world which is without end. Modern man, by contrast, trapped by an anthropology which excludes all transcendence, dehumanized by a pseudo-psychology which identifies the source of otherworldly yearning in his lowest rather than his most exalted faculties, has been programmed to dismiss the traditional belief in an immortal soul as mythic or even bizarre. One does not have to be a believer to know that the consequences of this new dogma have been appalling. If there is no judgment, and hence no authentic ground of justice in the world, then morality, as secular philosophers have appreciated, is a myth. Right and wrong can at best be defined by consensus and institutionalized by majority vote. If life is not sacred, 1 million unborn children can be slain in a year and no moral law has been infringed. Further, if man's nature is not rooted in the metaphysical, if his destiny does not lie in some higher place, then his existence is desolate and meaningless, and can be articulated only through values and art forms which are broken evocations of ugliness and chaos. No culture since Adam has lived in a deeper ignorance of what man truly is, a symmetrical, noble form enshrining a soul, an organ capable of such translucence that it can, when the senses and passions which distract it are stilled, form a window onto that reality of which this world offers no more than a distorted reflection. For those human beings who have been granted the state of awakening, the real world which they survey is truer than anything they had known here below. All of us will see the real world, the akhirah, at death, but only the prophets fully know of it before they die, and hence can warn their contemporaries. The revelations which God gives them, and which they give to mankind, are thus the only sources of meaning and understanding which will ever be available. To hold to them is to cling to a rope let down from God, while to let go is to fall ineluctably into chaos. Muslims are aware that today's dominant culture, and we should recall that its dominance lies exclusively on the political and economic plane, is built on a single determining fact, the considered rejection of Christianity. This apostasy was the logical result of Europe's discovery that the Bible was a historical product, a distorted text in which the words of the prophets could no longer be heard with confidence. Cut off from any reliable access to the transcendent, Europe's outlook could henceforth seek descriptions of the world only through the physical sciences, which were by definition incapable of yielding information about the akhirah, or about man's meaning, rather than his material surroundings. Modern man thus appears as the absolute antithesis of the man of Iman, the man of secure awareness of the divine reality and the tremendous destiny which awaits those who respond to it. Although past scholars of Islam have written innumerable works in this field, a small number have won particular popularity. These are of differing lengths and orientations. Some use a rhetorical style to strike fear and hope into the heart, while others are matter-of-fact rehearsals of orthodox belief. A list of the best known of these is offered in an appendix. The Lives of Man is, like all the books of Imam al-Haddad, remarkable for its succinctness and clarity. In this he was undoubtedly assisted by being a latecomer in Muslim history, as he was able to draw on the works of his predecessors. Like almost all ulama, he found the work of Imam al-Ghazali to be of especial value, and this is reflected both in the content and the texture of his work. Imam al-Haddad's purpose in the Lives is to remind Muslims of the fact of death and the judgment, but it is also written to help us to remind ourselves. It is not simply a list of the delights and suffering which lie beyond death, or a moralizing condemnation of sin. It is far more intelligent and far more human. Imam al-Haddad was a teacher who was visited every day by students and ordinary people from every walk of life. He knew their problems, both the outward ones and those of the soul. In particular, he knew about the qalb, the heart, which, as the Quran tells us, is an instrument of perception granted to man by God. As God says, He it is who created you and gave you ears and eyes and hearts. Chapter 67, verse 23. He knew that a man might know every detail about the next life and yet remain in a state of forgetfulness and distraction because his qalb had hardened. In speaking of the hereafter then, the Imam chooses the material which is best calculated to awaken the heart and fill it with the purifying fear of God and hope for His mercy. The works of Imam al-Haddad share in a trait of al-Ghazali's writings in that one cannot read them casually. To open any page, even at random, is to have the attention caught and the heart engaged. In these pages, the reader will not find the colorful and exotic stories of the hereafter common in many other works. There is poetry, but it is there for the effect on the soul, not because it elucidates some rare point of grammar. There is no trace of egotism or opinion. All the Imam does is to display the devastating Quranic and authentic hadith texts which serve the aim of his book. In short, this is Islamic scholarship at its most rigorous and effective. Imam al-Haddad begins his treatment at its logical starting point. The first life of man, he tells us, is that which we have already passed through entirely, life before conception. He cites the famous Quranic verse, chapter 7, verse 172, which describes how the souls of all mankind were taken forth from Adam's loins and made to declare their faith in the divine unity. The memory of this, preserved in the embryonic human consciousness, fades before birth. The second life is our existence in the dunya, that tiny slice of reality with which we are most familiar. Imam al-Haddad explains that life in this period divides into 5 stages: childhood, youth, maturity, seniority, and decrepitude, and that man has distinct spiritual requirements and abilities in each of these. The third life begins at the moment of death, when man enters the barzakh, literally the intermediate realm, which separates the dunya from the events of the judgment. All people are visited by 2 angels, Munkar and Nakir, to be asked about their beliefs and their actions, after which they receive a foretaste of their future experiences in the garden or the fire. The chapter includes a discussion on how the living may help the dead, and examines the question of visiting graves and tombs. It closes with a brief treatment of the coming of Jesus and Imam Mahdi, upon them be peace, and the Dajjal. The fourth life takes the reader through the events of the judgment, the trumpet blast, the gathering, the bridge, the balance, and the intercession of the messenger. May blessings and peace be upon him. The book then moves on to the everlasting fifth life, describing the uproar of the fire, and the crystalline, archetypal perfection of paradise. Following the example of Imam al-Ghazali, it closes on an optimistic note, with a short afterword on the vision of God's face, which will be granted to the blessed in heaven, together with a sequence of hadiths describing God's ultimate mercy and compassion for his creatures. We ask God the Exalted to render us among those he takes from life in the best of states, and protects from the trials of the life which is to come. Ameen. This was written by Abdul Hakim Murad in London in the year 1411 after Hijrah.